It's 2030, and buried in the ABA's annual report, there's a number that doesn't make sense. The law school classes that enrolled between 2025 and 2026, right in the middle of the worst structural disruption legal education has faced in decades, are carrying less debt relative to their income than any cohort in the past 15 years. Not the classes before them when times were good, not the classes after them when the system stabilized, it's the ones who walked in during the crisis. And that's not supposed to happen. These were the students who enrolled while schools were closing, while AI was reshaping what junior lawyers do, while the federal loan system was being rewritten, when serious people were publicly saying that law school was a bad bet. Every signal in the environment said to stay away. But the people who ignored those signals came out ahead. My name is Steve Schwartz. I run LSAT Unplugged. I've spent my career helping students navigate the LSAT and the law school admissions process. And what I'm about to walk you through is a scenario, not a prediction. Think of it as a stress test written as a story from the future. Every force I describe is already in motion right now in 2026. I'm going to play it forward to show you what it looks like when those forces converge. Not from the perspective of law schools, but from the perspective of the students who used the crisis to their advantage. We're going to stay in 2030 for most of this, and I'll tell you when we come back to the present. Now, to understand why the mid-2020s cohort did so well, you've got to understand how bad things looked when they enrolled. By 2025 and 2026, a dozen structural forces were converging on legal education at the same time. The demographic cliff, fewer college-age Americans because birth rates dropped during the Great Recession, was shrinking the applicant pool. Congress had capped federal graduate lending, blowing a hole in how most students paid for law school. The ABA had opened the door to LSAT optional admissions, and the pricing structure that held the whole system together was starting to wobble. AI was transforming what junior lawyers do. States were breaking from national accreditation, and the bar exam was being rewritten, and schools that had borrowed heavily during the boom years were starting to feel the weight of those loans. Schools were closing, revenue was falling, the news was relentlessly negative. And in the middle of all that, a certain kind of student looked at the chaos and saw something nobody else was talking about: leverage. Every one of those forces that was squeezing law schools was handing power to law school applicants. Schools desperate to fill seats meant they would give out more scholarship money. Pressure on outcomes meant better educational support. And AI disruption meant a first mover advantage for students willing to learn the tools. A fractured market meant geographic strategy could outperform prestige. The students who understood that and acted on it are the ones we're going to follow. Now, let's start with the money, because this is where the story gets concrete. Let's take one graduate from the class of 2028. We'll call her Maya. She applied in fall 2025 with a 164 LSAT, a 3.6 GPA, a first-generation college student. She had solid numbers, but nothing that would have turned heads 5 years earlier. In 2020, those numbers got her into a handful of law schools in the 40 to 60 range with modest scholarship money and a relatively polite welcome letter. In 2025, she got offers from 8 law schools, 2 in the top 30, 1 offered a full ride. But the difference wasn't Maya. The difference was that the demographic cliff had arrived, not as a forecast at a conference, but as empty chairs in admissions offices. At the same time, the lending caps meant students couldn't borrow as freely, which made them more price sensitive, which meant schools had to discount harder to compete. Applicant pools were contracting. Schools outside the top 20 were watching their classes shrink in real time. Deans were having conversations with university CFOs that they'd never had before. The math was simple. Seats needed to be filled or revenue models would break. Most applicants that cycle took their best offer and said thank you. And we'll come back to one of them, a guy named James, because his story and Maya's start in the exact same place, but they end up somewhere very different. Maya almost did the same thing. Her instinct was to take the best offer immediately, lock it in, be grateful. She said later that the idea of negotiating felt dangerous, like the school might get offended and pull the offer, like she was being greedy for even thinking about it. But here's the thing she did not yet understand. She wasn't negotiating with a person, she was negotiating with a budget line. Schools that year had enrollment targets they had to hit and discount rates they'd already built into their financial models. The money was already allocated. The question was just whether she'd ask for it. So she made the right choice. She pushed through the discomfort. She emailed her top choice, a school ranked in the low 30s that had offered her a half scholarship, and she wrote something like, "Thank you so much for this generous offer. I'm very excited about attending, but I've received a full tuition scholarship from peer school. I prefer to be at your school, but the financial gap is significant. Is there any flexibility?" A week later, they came back at 75% off tuition. She wrote back, "I really appreciate the increase, but peer school is still at full tuition, and I have a near full offer from second peer school. I completely understand if this is your best offer, but I wanted to be transparent about where things stand before I make my final decision." They came back at 85% off. 2 emails, that's all she sent, maybe took an hour of her time. Saved her roughly $40,000 over 3 years. And the only thing that almost stopped her was a feeling that she wasn't supposed to ask. Now, one important thing here. Every offer she referenced was real. She could document all of them. You never want to bluff an offer you can't back up because admissions talks to each other. If you make up a competing offer, you might get caught, and you might lose everything, including the original offer. Maya didn't play games. She was transparent about real offers and real options, and she simply asked a straightforward question, and that's why it worked. Now, let me explain why this wasn't just Maya being savvy. This was structural. The lending caps changed the game. Under the old system, a student could borrow whatever a school charged, tuition, living expenses, all of it. Schools could raise prices because the money was always there. When Congress capped federal graduate loans at $50,000 per year and $200,000 for life, a student at a $270,000 private school suddenly had a $70,000 gap or shortfall. And that gap had to be filled by private lenders. And private lenders, unlike the federal government, actually look at whether the school produces graduates who can pay the money back. So the same schools that were losing applicants to the demographic cliff were also losing the financial backstop that had let them charge whatever they wanted. And so students became more price sensitive. Schools had to compete harder on cost, and discount rates hit record highs. The crisis made law school dramatically cheaper, but only for the people who realized they could ask. So Maya took the 85% off scholarship and enrolled. And the law school she walked into was in the middle of reinventing itself out of pure necessity. For decades, law schools had operated on a basic formula. You recruit smart students, teach theory for 3 years, hand them a degree, and you let the job market sort them out. And that works when demand is high and nobody's asking hard questions about outcomes. But by 2025, both of those conditions had evaporated. The American Bar Association was scrutinizing bar passage rates more aggressively than at any point in recent memory, and with the launch of the next-gen bar exam, which tested actual lawyering skills like research, client counseling, and negotiation, not just memorization of 14 different subjects, schools could not just cram for the bar exam anymore. They actually had to teach practice-ready skills. The schools that did not invest in that saw their passage rates slip, which hurt their recruiting, which tightened the financial squeeze. At the same time, rankings were shifting weight towards employment outcomes, and prospective students, this generation in particular, were making enrollment decisions based on hard data, not the glossy brochures or the campus aesthetics or prestige. The ABA 509 disclosures were public, and students were actually reading them. So schools that couldn't show results started losing applicants to schools that could. And that created a survival incentive to invest in things that actually produce results, like academic support that caught struggling students early, not after they were already drowning, or bar exam prep integrated into the curriculum from 2L on, not crammed into the spring of 3L year, or career services offices rebuilt around actual employer relationships, not just a job board and 2 networking events per semester, and clinical programs where students practiced real legal work for real clients. By 2027, the average law student was getting meaningfully more hands-on experience than students 5 years before, with more clinic hours, more externship placements, more simulation-based courses where you did the actual work of being a lawyer, not just the theory of it. Maya's school launched an AI-integrated legal research clinic during her 2L year. The program hadn't existed when she enrolled, but they created it because the school needed to demonstrate it was training actual students for the profession as it was actually evolving, not as it used to be. She got 60 hours of supervised, real client work using tools that most practicing attorneys had never touched. She didn't know it at the time, but that clinic was going to be the thing that got her hired. Which brings us to the force that scares people the most, and the one that ends up defining the entire story. In 2024 and 2025, the anxiety around AI was everywhere. Students questioned whether they were investing 3 years and 6 figures into a career that technology was about to hollow out. Practicing attorneys questioned their own relevance. Law schools scrambled to figure out whether to ban the tools, teach them, or just pretend the whole thing wasn't happening. Now, here's what was actually happening to the legal profession. Of course, AI did not replace lawyers wholesale, but what it did was replace significant chunks of junior level work. The doc review that used to require 6 associates for 2 weeks became 2 associates and an AI tool for 3 days. The research memo that took a first-year associate all weekend became a 2-hour project. The contract analysis that justified billing a team of 3 became a solo task with a machine doing the first pass. That didn't eliminate legal jobs, but it did restructure them. Firms hired fewer junior associates. The ones they did hire had to be better, more adaptable, more judgment intensive, more capable of working with the tools rather than doing the tasks the tools replaced. And in the middle of the market, those $75,000 associate jobs at regional firms that used to absorb the middle of every graduating class, those got compressed hard. For a lot of graduates, it was devastating, but it created a strange advantage for the students who leaned in. There was a window, roughly 2025 to 2028, where the tools were powerful enough to transform legal work, but new enough that most of the profession was still struggling with them. Partners were cautious to the point of avoiding them altogether. Firms were publishing AI policies written by committees that didn't fully understand what they were even writing policies about. And in that gap between the technology's capability and the profession's competence, a small cohort of students was building something that couldn't be acquired any other way. Not just familiarity with the tools, but judgment on how to use them, when to trust the output and when to override it, where they hallucinated, where they saved real time, where they introduced risks that did not exist before. And the skill that turned out to matter the most wasn't prompting, because prompting is cheap and pretty learnable. It was verification, it was issue spotting, and knowing when the AI was confidently wrong. That is the hard part. And that's what separated those from used AI from the people who were actually good at using AI. And Maya herself was skeptical at first. Her 1L year, she thought it was mostly hype. Maybe useful for speeding up research, but not fundamentally different from a mildly better search engine. It wasn't until her clinic, where she involved herself with real matters, real clients, under real supervision, that she saw the actual scope and, more importantly, the limits. When she interviewed at a mid-sized firm in Austin, she didn't just tell them she could use AI tools, she walked the hiring partners through a clinic project where she'd used AI to compress a research task by about 60%, and then showed them the 2 substantive issues the tool had missed that she herself caught on manual review. One of those issues would have materially affected the client's position. The partners didn't really follow every technical detail, but they knew they needed someone who could do what she was describing, and she had an offer in hand by the end of the week. And that edge is already starting to narrow. Students entering law school now are growing up with the tools so seamlessly embedded that they may never develop the same feel for what's happening underneath, and practicing attorneys are only slowly catching up. But that mid-2020s cohort hit the sweet spot. They were early enough to build real expertise, but late enough that the tools were worth building expertise in, and that compounds over an entire career. The crisis also reshaped who could go to law school at all, and this part of the story doesn't really get enough attention. For most of its history, law school was designed for one kind of student: young, unattached, able to move to wherever the school was and spend 3 years doing little else. If you didn't fit that profile, if you were a working parent, a career changer with a mortgage, someone in a rural area without a law school nearby, the door was essentially closed, but the crisis forced it open. Online and hybrid programs matured quickly during this period. The predatory ones, programs with abysmal bar passage rates that existed mostly to collect tuition, those died first. They were among the earliest casualties of the lending caps because private lenders looked at their outcomes and said no. But the programs that survived were legitimate. They were accredited, and they were producing graduates who passed the bar and got hired. They just delivered the education in a format that didn't demand you uproot your entire life. Working parents who could study after their kids went to bed, or career changers in their 30s and 40s who couldn't walk away from a salary. People in parts of the country with no law school within 100 miles, or veterans using GI Bill benefits on their own schedule. The crisis didn't just improve law school for traditional students, it made legal education possible for people who had been locked out entirely. At the same time, LSAT optional admissions kept expanding. Some schools took the GRE. Others went test optional for certain applicant populations. Now, there's a separate conversation to be had about whether that's good for the profession long term, because when law schools lost their common yardstick for evaluating applicants, it created real pricing problems and arguably contributed to bar passage declines at some schools. So the test optional movement was a mixed bag at best for institutions. But for applicants, it meant there were more ways in, more pathways, and less of a high-stakes gatekeeping moment. And here's the flip side that most people miss. For students like Maya, who did invest in a strong LSAT score, the competitive advantage actually sharpened. When part of the applicant pool isn't submitting standardized scores at all, a strong number actually matters more, because schools still needed to protect their medians for rankings purposes. A 164 with a documented score was more valuable to a school's profile than an applicant with no score at all. Maya's LSAT investment paid off more in 2025 than the same score would have in 2020 because scarcity made it more useful as a signal. Then there's what happened after graduation. And this is where the story surprised a lot of people. You'd expect that graduates entering a disrupted, AI-compressed legal market would struggle, and many did. The ones at weaker schools, with no tech fluency in flat markets. But the strategic applicants and strategic graduates, the ones who'd been intentional about choosing a school, building their skills, and positioning themselves, they walked into a job market with more leverage than any recent cohort. And here's why. Law firms had a structural hole in their workforce. The Great Resignation had pulled mid-level associates out of the pipeline. People left for tech, for consulting, for in-house roles, for careers outside law entirely. And partners retired earlier than expected. And you can't fast-track the production of a lawyer with 5 years of experience. That gap does not close on its own. At the same time, the work had not gone away. Regulatory complexity was increasing. AI adoption was creating new legal questions around liability, IP, and compliance, and litigation was not slowing down. Firms needed people, but they just needed fewer of them, and they needed them to be better. And so the classes of 2027, 2028, and 2029 graduated into that gap. Maya had 3 competing offers by September of her 3L year, and for the first time in her life, She negotiated something beyond a scholarship. Not just her salary, although the salary was higher than what new associates at her level were making even 2 years prior. She was negotiating her hours expectations, remote flexibility, the kind of matters she'd be staffed on. She asked for things that a new graduate from a school ranked in the low 30s would not have been in a position to ask for 5 years earlier. And the firm said yes because 2 other firms were also saying yes. She told me later that when the 3rd offer came in, something clicked. She wasn't lucky. She was on the right side of the same structural imbalance that had given her leverage on day 1 when she was negotiating scholarships as an applicant. The force that had been pressuring institutions had been working in her favor the entire time, and 3 years later, it was still working. Now, geography mattered too, and this is one most people didn't think about until it was too late. The crisis did not land evenly. It hit hardest in regions with shrinking populations, declining industries, and flat legal markets. It barely touched places where the economy was expanding, like Sunbelt metros or tech corridors or energy and biotech hubs, where new industries were generating legal work faster than local schools could produce graduates. Now, here is the simplest way to think about it. Rankings are national, but hiring is local. You are choosing a market. The question isn't just, what's the best school I can get into? It's, where do I want to build a career, and which school gives me the best pipeline into that market? Maya ended up picking Austin over higher ranked schools in the Northeast. And it wasn't, of course, prestige, it was market. She graduated into a city with expanding demand, growing industries, and a hiring pipeline that wasn't clogged by 40 years of alumni from the 3 same institutions. Some of her classmates, who chose ranking over positioning, ended up competing for fewer opportunities in shrinking markets with saturated alumni networks. She had options before she finished her last semester. Now, the students who treated school selection as a market entry strategy rather than a prestige competition disproportionately outperformed. Now, let me be straight with you for a minute. You've been hearing Maya's story throughout. Let me come back to James because I told you we would. James enrolled in the same year as Maya, similar LSAT, similar GPA. And here's the thing about James. He didn't make dumb decisions. He did exactly what smart, well-informed people had been told to do for 20 years. He chose a school in the Midwest, ranked about 15 spots above Maya's, because the name recognition felt safer. He didn't negotiate a scholarship because he didn't know that was an option. Nobody told him he could. He stayed away from AI tools because they felt like shortcuts, and he wanted to learn law the real way. He picked his school based on the ranking, he picked a city by default, and played by a more conventional strategy. The playbook had changed, but he was running the old playbook. By 2029, James was practicing in a city with flat demand and a surplus of graduates from stronger regional schools. He owed $80,000 more in debt than Maya. He was a competent junior associate, but competent in exactly the same way every other associate at his firm was competent, with nothing that set him apart. He's employed, he's a lawyer, he's going to be fine. But he did leave an enormous amount of value on the table, not because he was careless, but because the rules shifted and he did not adjust accordingly. He had the same starting point, same environment, same crisis, but with a different strategy and a different outcome. And I should also be clear about the very top of the market, the T14, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Chicago, and so on. They operated on different economics throughout all of this because they have massive endowments, they have global brands, and more applicants than they'll ever need. The leverage, the negotiating power, the institutional desperation I've been describing, that was a story at other schools ranked roughly 20 through 100. But the top of the market plays by different rules than it always has. But for the vast majority of applicants, the people targeting the range where most law students actually enroll, the mid-2020s were the most favorable window legal education has produced in modern memory. So here is the full picture from 2030. A generation of law schools went through the most serious structural crisis since the post-2008 collapse, and arguably worse, because this time the financial backstop was gone. The technology disruption was real, and the demographic math was working against them, all of this simultaneously. And the students who enrolled during that crisis, the ones who were strategic about it, came out with less debt, better training, stronger technology skills, and more career options than the classes on either side of them. Scholarship money was always on the table for anyone willing to ask. Schools were forced to invest in outcomes instead of coasting on reputation. And a technology advantage that early adopters locked in and that can't be replicated after the fact. Expanded access for people the old system had shut out. A job market with a mid-level talent gap that tilted leverage toward new graduates. And a profession that, through all the disruption, still needed well-trained lawyers, maybe more than ever. The Mayas won, and the Jameses did not. Then there were those people who saw everything Maya saw, agreed with all of it, and told themselves they'd apply next cycle. But by the time they did, the leverage had already started to narrow. Applicant pools adjusted, and the schools that survived stabilized. The extraordinary window that the mid-2020s applicants walked through started closing as the market found its new equilibrium. The difference was never talent, it was just strategy and timing. Now, that's 2030. But you're not watching this in 2030, you're watching this right now in 2026. And every single force I just described is already in motion. The demographic cliff is here. College-age populations are shrinking, and law school applicant pools will start to feel it soon. The lending caps are in effect, Grad Plus loans no longer covers everything, and students are more price sensitive than ever. Schools are already discounting to fill seats. The ABA is already scrutinizing outcomes more aggressively. The next-gen bar exam is already rolling out. AI tools are already transforming how firms staff and hire. The mid-level talent gap at firms already exists. This window is open right now, today. Of course, I'm not saying everything I described will play out exactly as I told it. Some forces will hit harder than I modeled, others might arrive slower, but the structural pressures are real, they are converging, and the opportunity they create for strategic applicants is available right now. So let me talk directly to you now. If you're thinking about law school, I want you to be strategic because the opportunity I described is real, but it only works if you approach it deliberately. You want to research out schools by employment outcomes, not just the rankings. The data is public. It's called 509 data on the ABA website, and it tells you exactly what percent of applicants and graduates got what kinds of jobs at what salaries. Every ABA accredited law school has to publish it. If you don't know how to read it, I have other videos on this on the YouTube channel. I also want you to get competing offers and negotiate transparently with documented numbers. You are not being greedy. You are responding rationally to a market where schools need enrolled students. Do not, I repeat, do not leave money on the table because it feels impolite to ask. The schools have already budgeted for discounts. The question is whether that money goes to you or to somebody who asked when you didn't. I also want to recommend that you lean into the AI tools now, not later. The sweet spot I described, where the tools are powerful, but the profession hasn't caught up, that's right now. You want to build the judgment while you still can, because by the time everybody else figures it out, the advantage has already shifted to those who got there first. Also, think about where you want to practice, not just where you want to go to school. Rankings are national, hiring is local, you want to choose a market, and you want to look at where legal demand is growing, where industries are expanding, where the alumni pipeline is not already saturated. And also, ask the schools the hard questions. What are your actual employment outcomes? What is your plan if enrollment drops? How are you preparing schools and students for a profession that's being reshaped by technology? The schools that can answer those questions clearly are the ones worth attending. The schools that cannot are the ones that might not be around when you graduate. And if you want help doing that, building the right school list, writing the scholarship negotiation, putting together an application strategy built for this moment, I have plenty of resources on the channel covering all of this. Either way, don't sit on this. Don't be the person who sees the window and decides to just think about it for another year. The students who won the crisis were the ones who moved while the window was open. In 2030, you've got two groups looking back at this exact moment. One group moved, the other group is still thinking about it. You don't want to be the one who's still thinking about it.